would be easy, but when he arrived in the village, it was hell. No water, no electricity. What he found out later turned his life upside down. Watch until the end and write in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The wind outside Robert Miller's modest two-story home in Vermont whispered through the naked trees, making them creak like old bones. Winter had not yet set in with its full vengeance, but the chill in the air was enough to pierce the bones of anyone who dared to linger outdoors. Inside, the ticking of a wall clock echoed in the living room like the sound of a slow, patient countdown. 62 years of life, and now the days stretched ahead of Robert with the quiet finality of an empty road at dusk. The house, once filled with laughter and the scent of his wife's baking, now smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. He sat in his recliner, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, a steaming mug of chamomile tea cooling beside him. A dusty photo frame on the side table held the smiling face of Margaret, his late wife, frozen in time beside him, forever 48, forever radiant. It had been 3 years since she passed. Cancer had taken her piece by piece, stripping away her strength and light until all that remained was a fragile shell and the unbearable silence she left behind. Since then, Robert's world had contracted. His daughter, Emily, had her own life in California, busy with 2 kids and a corporate job that left little room for long conversations or cross-country visits. Phone calls had become rare. Holidays had grown shorter, and the sense of isolation wrapped itself tighter around him like ivy on brick. His neighbors were polite but distant. His former colleagues at the community college sent him the occasional email, but time had a way of eroding even the strongest professional ties. Loneliness, he discovered, was not always loud. Sometimes it was a quiet, creeping thing that settled in the corners of the room and stayed there, watching. He had resisted online communication for years, scoffing at social media and the idea of virtual friendships. But as days turned to months and months into empty seasons, he found himself wandering through forums and blogs, reading stories from other retirees, people like him who had lost partners or simply never found them in the first place. One evening, he stumbled upon a site dedicated to cultural exchange and global pen pal connections. It was old-fashioned, not flashy, filled with long-form letters, poetry, and journal-like musings from people around the world. It felt authentic in a way that most things online didn't. That's where he first saw the username Nia_84 Kenya. Her post was simple, a short reflection on the challenges of teaching English in rural Kenya, a few lines about her students and their dreams, and a quote from Maya Angelou that made him pause. Hope and fear cannot occupy the same space. Invite one to stay. He read her post 3 times before composing a response. His message was cautious, respectful, just a few paragraphs introducing himself, sharing how her words moved him, and complimenting her passion for teaching. He didn't expect a reply. But the next morning, there it was, an email with the subject line, "Greetings from Kenya." That was how it began. Their correspondence evolved gradually, like the slow thaw of early spring. Nia's letters were articulate, thoughtful, filled with anecdotes about her students, her village, her late father, and her dreams of opening a school for girls. She wrote about the challenges women faced in her region, about how education could change lives, about her frustrations with the government, and her hope for a better future. There was no flirtation, no mention of money, just stories, questions, humor, and wisdom that belied her 34 years. Robert, in turn, found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years. He wrote about his love for literature, his memories of teaching, his favorite dishes, his awkward attempts at cooking since Margaret passed. He told her about the icy Vermont winters, the moose that once wandered into his backyard, the time his students surprised him with a retirement party. Nia responded with warmth and curiosity, always remembering details, always asking about his day. She sent him photos of her village, of sunrises over dry fields, of children holding handmade signs that read, "Welcome, Uncle Robert." Weeks turned into months. What had begun as cautious communication grew into a daily ritual. He would wake up, make coffee, and rush to check his inbox. Her presence became a part of his routine. Her voice, though only in writing, was the one he heard in his mind when he made breakfast or walked through town. When Nia asked if they could video chat, he hesitated, nervous about how he looked, about the age gap, about the reality of seeing her face. But when they finally did, it was like meeting an old friend. Nia was striking. Her dark eyes held a depth and kindness that disarmed him immediately. Her voice had a melodic lilt, her laugh was unforced, and her expressions animated. She called him "You, Mr. Robert," at first, which made him chuckle. He called her Miss Nia, which made her roll her eyes and laugh. In those conversations, the screen between them faded, and the 28 years between them felt less like a chasm and more like a bridge. They began to talk about dreams, not just hers. She asked him what he still wanted from life, what he regretted, what he feared. No one had asked him those things in years. He admitted he feared dying alone, that he missed the feeling of being needed, that he wanted to matter to someone again. Nia never spoke of poverty, but she didn't need to. The background of her calls revealed cracked walls, flickering electricity, the sound of roosters and motorcycles and children in the background. She mentioned her part-time work at a local market on weekends, how she struggled to pay for internet data, how her dream of a school felt farther away each year. But she never asked him for anything. That, more than anything, made him trust her. When she said, one evening, "I wish you could see my village," his heart leapt in a way he hadn't expected, and when she added, almost shyly, "I think you'd like it here," he began to imagine what that might look like. The idea seemed wild at first, an old white man moving to Africa to meet a woman half his age. He could hear the judgmental murmurs, the warnings, the disbelief. But in the silence of his Vermont kitchen, with only the hum of the refrigerator and the weight of his solitude, it didn't seem so crazy. He spent weeks researching Kenya, the culture, the language, the geography. He studied Swahili phrases, looked up local customs, and even emailed the American Embassy in Nairobi for travel guidelines. He wasn't naive. He'd read stories about scams, about men being taken advantage of by younger women from poorer countries. But Nia was different. She didn't chase him. He pursued her. She never asked for money. He offered help for her school, which she politely declined. Everything felt genuine. It was late November when he made the decision. He would go, not forever, at least not yet, but long enough to see her world, to meet the woman behind the letters, to decide whether this connection could be something real. He sold his car, transferred his teaching pension into a liquid account, and booked a one-way flight to Nairobi with the option to return after 3 months. He told Emily he was going on a personal journey, though she didn't pry. He packed light, just one suitcase, his passport, a notebook, and the paperback copy of The Old Man and the Sea Margaret had once gifted him. The night before his flight, he stood outside on the porch, breathing in the crisp Vermont air one last time. The stars were bright, the moon silent. He thought of all the things that could go wrong, and then he thought of Nia's eyes. The next morning, he boarded the plane. As it taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky, Robert stared out the window, feeling a strange cocktail of excitement and terror. Somewhere across the world, a woman who called him Dear Soul was waiting. And for the first time in years, Robert Miller felt not old, not invisible, but full of something he hadn't dared feel in a long time: hope. The wheels touched down at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport just after sunset. From the airplane window, Robert could see the fading traces of a golden sky melting into a horizon of copper and smoke. He felt the familiar tremor of nerves in his chest as passengers shuffled to gather their belongings, conversations blossoming around him in languages he didn't recognize. It had been over 20 hours since he left Vermont, and fatigue had settled deep into his bones, but beneath it all, something else stirred: anticipation. Outside, the air was dense and humid, different from the crisp bite of New England, carrying the scent of dust, exhaust, and something faintly sweet, maybe mango or jasmine or just the unknown. The airport terminal was bustling with energy. Voices echoed across the wide spaces, announcements blurred through faulty speakers, and families reunited with cries of joy and long, breathless embraces. Robert moved slowly, clutching the handle of his worn suitcase, his eyes scanning for a familiar face. It didn't take long. Near the exit, holding a simple cardboard sign that read "Robert" in bold black marker, stood Nia. She looked smaller in person than on the screen, but more vivid, more alive. Her dark eyes searched the crowd and then landed on him. Her face lit up, not with the wide smile of an actress playing a part, but with something that seemed tender and genuine. She waved, stepped forward, and hugged him. It wasn't a rushed, awkward greeting. It was full-bodied, warm, and lingering. Robert held her, conscious of the difference in their skin tones, the contrast in age, but more conscious of the steady rhythm of her breath and the scent of sun and soap in her hair. "You made it," she said, her voice soft and musical. "Karibu, Kenya. Welcome." Outside the terminal, the chaos intensified. Taxis, minibuses called matatus, and motorcycles jostled for space. Horns honked in a cacophony of urgency. A layer of orange dust clung to the ground. The air, the trees, the people. Robert's shoes, polished before the trip, quickly dulled with grit. They climbed into a battered Toyota sedan, its interior worn but clean. The driver, introduced as David, nodded politely but spoke little. Nas slid into the front seat and began chatting with him in rapid Swahili. Robert leaned back, watching the city unfold through the window. Nairobi was alive in a way he'd never experienced. Street vendors pushed carts stacked with roasted maize and pineapples. Children darted between cars, their laughter rising above the traffic. Men sat on plastic stools under glowing signs advertising mobile data and soda, while women balanced baskets on their heads with effortless grace. It was vibrant, chaotic, loud, and beautiful in its own stubborn rhythm. He expected to be taken to a hotel, perhaps a modest guest house. Instead, Nia turned to him with a bright smile and said, "We'll drive to the village tonight. It's only 6 hours." Before he could respond, the car turned off the main highway and onto a narrower, bumpier road. Street lights grew scarce. The sky deepened into an inky black scattered with stars. Robert said nothing, not wanting to seem ungrateful or uncertain, but the fatigue pressed harder and his spine ached with every jolt. Hours passed. The paved road gave way to dirt. Then even the dirt seemed to disappear, replaced by uneven paths where grass and rock merged without warning. Occasionally, they passed small clusters of huts with thatched roofs and low fires flickering in the darkness. Dogs barked. The occasional bicycle light cut through the blackness like a ghost. Around midnight, the car stopped. David opened the trunk, and Nia motioned for Robert to follow. They had arrived. In the dim light, he saw a collection of structures: mud walls, thatched roofs, the faint outline of fences made from sticks and twisted wire. A chicken scurried past. The scent of wood smoke hung thick in the air. Nia took his hand and led him toward a small hut with a door hanging loosely on one hinge. Inside, it was dark, lit only by a single battery-powered lantern that cast long shadows against the walls. The floor was packed earth. A thin mattress lay in the corner, covered by a faded sheet. There was no fan, no window, only a small hole for air. "This is my home," she said softly. "I know it's not much, but I wanted you to see where I come from." Robert smiled, though his throat was dry and his stomach turned. "It's different," he said honestly. "We'll fix it up together," she replied, squeezing his hand. "Tomorrow I'll show you everything." The night was long. Mosquitoes whined near his ears. The heat wrapped around him like a damp blanket. He lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds: goats bleating, distant drums, laughter, cries of infants, the croak of frogs. His back ached from the hard ground. Sweat pooled in the hollow of his spine. At one point, he stumbled outside to relieve himself behind the hut, guided only by moonlight. He tried to remind himself that discomfort was temporary, that love required sacrifice. In the morning, roosters announced the dawn with cacophonous pride. Nia brought him a bowl of warm water to wash with, poured from a tin kettle. Breakfast was boiled maize and black tea. They sat on overturned crates outside the hut, and for a moment, Robert felt the pull of something simple and grounding. Then came the chores. Nia handed him a plastic jerry can and pointed toward the path that led to the village well. "The children usually fetch water, but they're at school. It's not far." It was farther than he expected, over a mile each way. The can was heavy, the path uneven. By the time he returned, sweating and breathless, he nearly collapsed. Flies buzzed incessantly. His clothes clung to his skin. Nia laughed gently and wiped his forehead with a cloth. "You'll get used to it." Later, she introduced him to her mother, a small, stooped woman with cloudy eyes and hands rough from years of work. She spoke little English, but greeted Robert with a warm embrace. Nia translated, saying, "She says you have kind eyes, and you're brave for coming here." They visited neighbors, many of whom looked at Robert with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Children trailed behind him, giggling and calling out Mzungu, the Swahili word for white foreigner. Some villagers greeted him warmly. Others stared in silence. He smiled through it all, telling himself this was part of the journey, part of the connection. He imagined earning their respect, becoming part of the community. Days passed in a blur of newness and fatigue. Robert tried to help where he could, gathering firewood, assisting with simple repairs, teaching a few English words to curious children. But his body protested. His back ached. His feet blistered. His stomach turned violently after a meal of boiled cassava. The latrine was a hole in the ground behind a patch of bushes, and the lack of privacy was humiliating. And yet, he tried to endure. Nia remained a source of light. In the evenings, they would sit together under the stars, her head on his shoulder, her fingers interlaced with his. She spoke of the future, a schoolhouse with desks, uniforms, and books. She showed him sketches, lists of supplies, even a notebook with potential donors and budget plans. her voice filled with conviction. Robert listened, nodding, telling himself that discomfort was temporary, that love was worth this. But doubt began to stir. One night he awoke to find her bed empty. The lantern had burned out. He waited. An hour passed. 2. At dawn, she returned, saying she'd gone to help a neighbor give birth. Her dress was clean. Her hands smelled of perfume, not blood or sweat. He said nothing. Instead, he carried more water, gave more money, bought a solar lamp for the hut, paid for a new roof. Each act justified in the name of love, in the name of sacrifice. By the end of the second week, the village began to feel less like an adventure and more like a cage. His skin was sunburned. He had lost weight. His clothes hung loosely. The man who had arrived full of hope was now squinting into the horizon, wondering if he had made a mistake. And yet, every time he considered leaving, Nia would touch his hand, look into his eyes, and whisper, "You came for me. Don't give up now." So he stayed. He told himself it was courage, but in truth it was fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being alone again. Fear that if he left, he would lose the last fragile chance at love he might ever have. By the third week, Robert had stopped counting days. Time in the village no longer felt linear. It was a circle of rising suns and falling moons, of meals boiled over fires and walks to the well, of sweat-soaked shirts and mosquito-bitten legs. The novelty had worn away, and in its place came an ache that settled deep in his joints and deeper still in his heart. He told himself it was just adjustment, that once the school project truly got underway, everything would feel meaningful again. He reminded himself that comfort wasn't the point. Connection was. Love was. And that, he believed, required endurance. Nia seemed to sense his fatigue and frustration. She greeted him each morning with kisses and soft words, brought him mango slices, and told him to rest while she handled the hard parts. She returned often with updates about meetings with village elders, discussions with local officials, inquiries into permits. Her voice brimmed with urgency and hope, always pulling him forward just a little longer. "We're so close," she said one evening, sitting beside him on the hut's crude bench. "I know it's hard, but you've given me the chance to change everything. These girls deserve a classroom. They deserve a future." It was impossible to resist her when she spoke like that. Robert, determined to see the dream realized, began spending from the savings he had promised himself he'd never touch. He paid a local laborer named Jomo to begin clearing a patch of land near the edge of the village. He wired money to a builder Nia recommended, a man she claimed was honest and experienced. He funded the purchase of timber, iron sheets, cement, and nails. Every day he rose early, overseeing what little progress he could see, offering bottles of water to workers, jotting down notes in a tattered notebook. He felt, for a while, purposeful again, but signs of decay were already showing. Materials arrived late or not at all. The builder was frequently absent, citing funerals or fuel shortages. Workers sat idle beneath the trees, their tools untouched. When Robert asked questions, they smiled politely and offered vague reassurances. Nia, when confronted, blamed bureaucracy. "It's how things work here," she said with a tired sigh. "Delays are normal. Corruption slows everything. But we'll get through it, trust me." He did. He had to. The alternative, that she was lying, that he was being used, was too heavy to bear. More money went out. He bought a generator to power tools that never ran, hired a painter for a building that wasn't finished. He paid for uniforms to be sewn, although no students were enrolled. When he asked to see receipts, Nia frowned. "Don't you trust me?" she asked quietly, hurt blooming in her eyes. "After everything you've seen here? After all we've shared?" And Robert, ashamed, backed down. He hated himself for even questioning her. The strain took a toll. He developed a persistent cough that worsened in the night. His stomach rebelled more often. He lost nearly 15 pounds. Villagers grew used to his presence but never truly accepted him. They nodded in passing, children waved, but the conversations were always shallow. He remained an outsider, a novelty, a source of amusement and rumor. Only Nia offered the illusion of belonging. One afternoon, she returned from town beaming. "I found the perfect deal," she announced, holding up a printed flyer. "A projector and screen, second-hand but functional, perfect for lessons. We can use it to show documentaries, even movies for the children. It'll bring them joy." Robert handed over the money, again without hesitation. That evening, she didn't come home. He waited on the bench outside the hut until the moon was high and the insects thick. When she returned near dawn, her explanation was brief. She'd missed the last bus, stayed with a cousin. She didn't look tired. Her dress was freshly pressed, her breath smelled faintly of wine. Still, he said nothing. The next day, she surprised him with a small plastic laptop, bright blue, already scuffed at the edges. "See?" she said proudly. "It works. It's a start." He nodded, ignoring the fact that it was a child's model, too underpowered to do anything meaningful, let alone teach classes. He thanked her, kissed her forehead, and told himself again that intention mattered more than results. Weeks passed. The school remained unfinished, a skeleton of timber and rusting tin. Rain poured through the roof. Weeds grew through the floor. The laborers stopped showing up. Jomo disappeared altogether. Robert asked questions again, this time more directly. Nia grew defensive. "You don't understand how hard it is," she snapped. "This isn't America. Things don't happen instantly. You promised you'd help." "I have helped," he said softly. "I've given everything I can." She turned away, her shoulders rigid. "Then give a little more. We're almost there." Later that night, lying awake, Robert stared at the shadows dancing on the ceiling. The wind whispered through the cracks in the hut's wall, and outside a goat bleated mournfully in the distance. He thought of his home in Vermont, of silence, of heat from a working radiator, of running water, of dignity. He tried to remember what it had felt like to believe this trip would bring him peace. All he felt now was depletion, but he still loved her. Or thought he did, or needed to believe he did. The line between love and desperation had grown thin. He told himself that Nia was under pressure, that poverty made people act strangely, that maybe she was just overwhelmed. He didn't want to be another white man who judged without understanding. And so, when she came to him days later, eyes glossy with tears, saying her younger cousin was ill and needed medicine they couldn't afford, he reached into his wallet again. "You don't have to," she said quietly. "I want to," he replied. And he did, not because he truly believed the story anymore, but because not giving would mean facing the truth. The truth that maybe she had never loved him. The truth that maybe this was never about the school. The truth that he had flown across the ocean chasing an illusion stitched together from loneliness and hope. The weight of that possibility was heavier than any water can or bag of cement. So he gave, again and again, until the money began to run low, until his American bank account, once sturdy with pension and savings, began to shrink into something fragile. One morning, he tried to access it online. The connection was poor, the login failed. When he finally succeeded, the numbers made his stomach drop. He was down to 5 digits. Half of what he had brought was gone, vanished into wires and receipts, into wooden beams and fabric and stories. He sat on the bench, the morning sun already hot on his face, and watched Nia laugh with a neighbor across the field. She was beautiful in that moment, radiant and carefree. And for the first time he wondered, what if none of it had ever been real? Not the dream, not the love, only the need, the transaction. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. Then he stood and walked to the edge of the field, where the bones of the unfinished school cast long shadows. He stood in that shade, staring at what they had tried to build, what he had tried to believe. And, for the first time since he'd arrived, he let doubt settle beside him, silent and certain. It didn't argue, it didn't gloat, it simply waited. The rains came suddenly, pounding the brittle earth and drowning the village in thick red mud. What had once been a dry field of weeds and concrete blocks became a shallow, murky lake, with the half-built schoolhouse standing like a stranded ship. Robert stood beneath the flimsy overhang at the side of the hut, watching sheets of water cascade off the roof, carrying away bits of straw and soil. The skeletal beams of the classroom quivered in the storm, the nails rusting, the boards warping. It looked less like a promise now, and more like a monument to something foolish and unfinished. Inside, Nia was curled on the mat with a blanket, scrolling through her phone. She said little these days, at least not to Robert. Her mood shifted often, sometimes effervescent and affectionate, other times distant and irritable. She was spending more nights away, claiming to be attending meetings in nearby towns or staying with cousins. The explanations were delivered casually, always accompanied by a smile too quick or eyes that didn't quite meet his. Robert didn't argue. He didn't have the strength. He had grown quieter with each passing week, retreating deeper into his own mind, tallying what he had lost. His body felt foreign now, thinner and older than he remembered. His pants sagged on his hips, his hands trembled more often, and the long walks to the well left him dizzy and breathless. A few times he'd woken in the night from dreams where he was back in Vermont, opening the door to his kitchen, only to find red mud seeping across the tiles. He had sent another transfer the week before, this time for a permit fee Nia said was required to legally operate the school. The receipt she showed him was a low-resolution photocopy, the official stamp slightly smudged. He'd said nothing, just nodded and returned to the silence that had become his daily companion. But silence could only suppress so much. Doubt, once invited, grows greedy. One morning, after Nia had left early for yet another trip to town, Robert sat alone on the stoop, watching children chase each other through puddles. A neighbor named Moses passed by, paused, and said something in Swahili that Robert couldn't understand. The tone wasn't unkind, but there was something in the way the man looked at him, an odd mixture of pity and amusement that twisted in his chest. Robert nodded politely and smiled. The man chuckled, shook his head, and walked on. Later that day, Robert wandered into the school site again, though he knew by now no one would be working. The boards were beginning to rot. Several of the nails had been pulled out. He found a wheelbarrow abandoned in the corner, its tire flat, its handles rusted. There was no sign of tools or supplies. It had become a ghost site, like the ruins of a failed utopia. He stood there for a long time, not moving, until the clouds rolled in again and the sky turned the color of bruises. That evening, he waited. When Nia returned, her dress was crisp, her hair freshly braided, her skin radiant. She carried a plastic bag of groceries, milk, bread, a few onions, and set them on the table like it was any other day. "Long trip," she said, not looking at him. The buses were late. "Where did you go?" he asked, his voice quieter than he expected. She glanced at him, then away. "I told you I had to meet the building officer." Robert nodded. "Did you get the permit?" "Yes, I'll show you tomorrow." Something inside him turned. "Show me now." Nia paused, her smile faltering. "Why are you acting like this?" "I just want to see it," he said. "That's all." She walked past him into the hut. He followed. She dug through a drawer, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and handed it to him. It was another blurry photocopy with a stamp that looked too clean, too perfect. He studied it, tracing the letters, noting the awkward spacing and mismatched fonts. His hands trembled, not with anger, but with something closer to sorrow. "I think we should talk," he said. "Later. I'm tired." She brushed past him again and disappeared behind the curtain that separated the sleeping area. That night, Robert lay awake on his mat, staring at the flickering shadows on the ceiling. He listened to the slow rhythm of her breathing, to the occasional grunt of a goat outside, to the drip of rainwater from the leaking corner of the roof. A thought took root and refused to be shaken. He reached for her phone, which lay on the stool beside her bag. He hesitated. Then, almost mechanically, he picked it up and turned it on. There was no password. The screen glowed softly, illuminating his gaunt face. What he found wasn't shocking. It was confirming. Messages from someone named Ryan filled the recent threads. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Some in English, some in shorthand slang. There were heart emojis, suggestive photos, affectionate nicknames, references to hotels, meetups, stolen moments. But most damning were the plans. Long conversations about the future, about how much longer they'd need to deal with the old man, about transfers and expenses, about the restaurant Ryan wanted to open once Nia had enough. Robert sat frozen, his thumb hovering over the screen. There was a message from that very day. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Got the room at the usual place. Love you." He put the phone down gently, stood, and walked outside. The night was cool, the moon was full. In the distance, he heard music from a neighboring hut, laughter echoing faintly across the fields. He walked until the hut was behind him, until the light of the lantern inside was nothing but a dot. He wanted to scream, to break something, to cry, but instead he stood in the dark and let the silence wrap around him like a shroud. When he returned, she was still asleep. Her face looked peaceful, serene. He stared at her for a long time, searching for the woman he had believed in. He couldn't find her. The next morning, he waited until she finished breakfast before placing the phone on the table and sliding it toward her. She blinked. Then her expression changed, not into panic, but into something colder, harder. "You went through my things," she said, voice low. "I had to know," he replied. "And now you do." She didn't try to explain. Not really. There was a moment, a flicker, where he thought he saw something behind her eyes. Fear, maybe, or regret, but it vanished quickly. What replaced it was calculation. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked. "I want a divorce." She laughed. "There is no divorce in Kenya, Robert. Didn't you read the laws before you came here? There's annulment, but it takes years. Years of court appearances, legal fees, judges who don't care. You think you can afford that now?" He said nothing. She stood. "Everything you gave me, gifts, that's what they are. You won't prove otherwise. You supported my family. You paid for my dreams. That's what love looks like, isn't it? So generous, so naive." He felt dizzy. She stepped closer. "And if you make noise, I'll make complaints. I'll say you hit me, that you forced yourself on me. You think immigration will believe you over me, a white man in an African village? You'll be deported in chains." Robert backed away slowly. His breath was shallow. She smiled. "You came here for a fantasy. I gave it to you. Now pay the price." She left that night, purse in hand, lips painted, humming as she disappeared into the dusk. Robert remained in the hut, motionless, surrounded by the shell of a life he thought he was building. The broken promises, the fake documents, the phantom school, the village that had never welcomed him. The children's laughter outside no longer sounded innocent. He spent the night staring at the wall, seeing everything clearly for the first time. Nia had never loved him. She had studied him, predicted him, built a performance around him, and he had applauded. In the morning, he looked into the small mirror above the basin and barely recognized the face staring back. The man in the reflection wasn't a romantic or a savior. He was a victim. And finally, he knew it. The days after the confrontation passed in a slow, disorienting fog. Robert moved through the village like a ghost, unnoticed, unneeded, untouched. Nia came and went freely, with no more explanations or excuses. She no longer pretended. There were no more soft glances across the hut, no more late-night murmurs of gratitude or fabricated stress over building permits. She lived as if he didn't exist, and perhaps in her eyes, he truly no longer did. Robert stayed inside most days, not from fear of her, but from the exhaustion that had seeped into every part of him. He no longer tried to engage with the neighbors. The children, who used to call him Mzungu, now avoided eye contact. He wasn't sure if the rumors had spread, or if they had never truly seen him as anything more than a strange white man playing a role in someone else's script. He avoided the mirror. His reflection had become a stranger. Sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, skin too pale and stretched over bones thinned by weeks of poor food and stress. He had not realized how much he had lost until he stopped pretending he had gained anything. The weight of humiliation sat on his chest constantly. How could he have been so blind? How had he, a man who prided himself on rationality, logic, and worldly experience, been so thoroughly deceived? He thought about Margaret often now, especially in the quiet moments before dawn. Not just because he missed her, though he did deeply, but because he wondered what she would say if she could see what he had become. Would she have warned him? Would she have understood the loneliness that had driven him across an ocean into the arms of a beautiful lie? There was no denying it now. He had to leave. But the logistics were tangled and dangerous. Nia had warned him, threatened him, about making any sudden moves. Her words echoed in his memory like a curse: deported in chains, immigration complaints, false accusations. And yet, staying meant surrender. It meant accepting the role she had assigned him, of silent provider, of shadowy placeholder, of captive. He still had his passport tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the hut. He hadn't dared keep it in plain sight after Nia's threat. His phone, once shared, was now guarded like gold. He used it sparingly, mostly to check his bank balance, which had dropped to just under $15,000, and to scroll through his contact list in search of someone, anyone, who could help. But in this place, in this country where he barely understood the language or the laws, he was utterly alone. Except for one name: Carlos Mendoza. They had met briefly at the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi during one of Robert's inquiries about property transfer laws. Carlos had been recommended as a private investigator, someone who specialized in helping foreigners navigate legal landmines in East Africa. Robert hadn't followed up then, too hopeful to admit he might need help. But now, Carlos's name was a lifeline. He composed a message slowly, careful not to sound panicked or reckless. It read simply, "Mr. Mendoza, I need your help. It's urgent. I need to leave Kenya quietly and safely. Can you assist? I'll pay whatever I can." He hit send. The reply came 3 hours later. "I remember you. Yes, I can help, but once you leave, there's no coming back. Do you understand?" Robert stared at the screen. His thumbs hovered, then typed, "I understand. I'm ready." They set the plan in motion over encrypted messages. Carlos would pick him up in a borrowed vehicle at a junction 30 minutes from the village at 4 a.m. Robert was to bring only what he could carry in one bag. No electronics, no traceable items, no notes left behind. Carlos would handle the airport logistics, including a ticket booked in a false name until check-in. The night before the escape, Robert lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling. He had packed his bag already. His passport, a change of clothes, a water bottle, Margaret's old paperback of The Old Man in the Sea, and the last of his Kenyan shillings. Everything else he had brought, the gifts, the clothes, the books, the tools, the photographs, would stay behind, swallowed by the same red dust that had covered every inch of his hope. Just before dawn, he left the hut. Nia hadn't come home that night. He wasn't surprised. The last time they spoke, she had laughed when he asked if she would be around. "I have better places to be," she said. "You should try it sometime." He walked past the skeletal frame of the school, its beams now blackened with mildew. The path to the junction was dark, the sky still bruised with the memory of night. Crickets chirped. A dog barked in the distance. His breath came slow and steady, though his heart pounded like it might burst through his chest. Carlos was waiting as promised, a plain vehicle parked at the edge of the road. He opened the passenger door without a word. Robert climbed in, his hands trembling. They drove in silence for the first 20 minutes, the headlights cutting through the mist like blades. Eventually, Carlos spoke. "You're lucky," he said without looking over. "I've seen worse endings. At least you're getting out with something." Robert laughed bitterly. "I'm getting out with nothing." Carlos shook his head. "You're getting out with your name, your freedom. That's more than some." They reached Nairobi just after sunrise. Carlos had already arranged the flight, an economy seat on a carrier bound for London, then a transfer to Boston. The name on the boarding pass was James Alder, a cover used often enough to avoid suspicion. Robert had to pay extra at the check-in counter to expedite security clearance, but it worked. His passport passed inspection. His bag cleared. No one stopped him. He boarded the plane without looking back. As the aircraft climbed into the sky, leaving the patchwork fields and rust-colored hills behind, Robert stared out the window with blank eyes. Somewhere below, Nia was likely waking up, perhaps reading the absence he left in the shape of an unmade bed, a vanished suitcase, and the silence of a man who no longer answered to her. Maybe she would panic. Maybe she wouldn't care. Maybe she already had another man waiting in line to replace him. It didn't matter anymore. The flight to London was long and uneventful. He didn't eat. He didn't speak. He barely moved. The layover was a blur of sterile corridors and automated announcements. On the final leg to Boston, something in him loosened. The cabin lights dimmed. He watched a child sleeping across the aisle and remembered Emily as a baby, curled against Margaret's chest during a camping trip in Maine. That memory brought tears, not for what he'd lost, but for the man he used to be. When he finally stepped off the plane in Boston, the cold air felt sharp and clean. His legs ached as he walked through customs. A border agent asked how long he'd been abroad. 8 months, Robert answered. The man nodded, stamped his passport, and waved him through. Dave was waiting outside. His old friend stood next to a battered pickup, arms folded, looking exactly the same. Broad-shouldered, weathered, steady. When he saw Robert, his expression shifted. Not shock, not pity, just quiet concern. "You look like hell," Dave said. "I feel worse." They hugged, awkwardly at first, then with more force than either expected. Dave took the suitcase, led him to the truck, and didn't ask questions. Not at first. The drive back to Vermont was long, but comforting in its silence. Snow lined the edges of the highway. The trees stood bare and still. It was familiar. It was real. "You can stay with me and Sarah as long as you need," Dave said as they pulled into his driveway. "Spare room's yours." "Thanks," Robert replied. "Just for a while. I'll figure the rest out." Later that night, lying in a real bed under clean sheets, he stared at the ceiling and waited for the shame to settle. But it didn't come. Not like before. There was grief, yes, and anger. But there was also relief. He had survived. And in that simple fact was a kind of freedom he hadn't known he needed. The guest room smelled faintly of lavender and cedar, a comforting scent that Robert hadn't realized he missed until he laid down that first night. The mattress beneath him was firm but forgiving, the sheets crisp, and the silence, true silence, felt like a balm against the rawness in his chest. No goats bleated outside. No leaking roof dripped beside his ear. No slivers of doubt pierced the darkness like mosquito whines. There was only the steady sound of the wind brushing against the window pane and the rhythmic creak of the house adjusting to the cold. He slept for 14 hours. When he awoke, it was mid-afternoon. The Vermont light slanted through the blinds in long, golden rays, illuminating the dust motes that floated in the air. For a few moments, he didn't remember where he was. His heart jolted. He reached for his phone to check for messages from Nia, to review his bank balance, to see if the embassy had called. But then it hit him. He was home. Not in the house he'd lived in for 40 years, not the home he shared with Margaret, but in the only place that now felt safe. Dave and Sarah treated him with gentle respect. They didn't pry. Sarah made soup and fresh bread the first night he was able to join them at the table. Dave filled his mug with hot coffee every morning without asking. They let him be quiet. Let him stare out the window for long stretches. Let him relearn the rhythm of a world that didn't expect anything from him but presence. His own home had been rented out while he was gone. A tenant had been living there for 6 months and was scheduled to move out by the end of the month. Dave offered to help him clean it up once it was vacant, but Robert wasn't sure he'd return. The idea of re-inhabiting that space, the one filled with Margaret's ghosts and now shadowed by the bitter residue of his time in Africa, made him uneasy. Still, he said he'd think about it. He spent the next few weeks moving through the world with the tentative steps of someone recovering from a near-fatal fall. Simple errands became tests of endurance. The grocery store overwhelmed him. The colors too bright, the chatter too sharp, the shelves too full of things he didn't need. He avoided eye contact. He didn't answer his phone when it rang, didn't check his email. He ignored his bank statements, knowing the damage had already been done. But the worst part wasn't the financial loss. It was the shame. When friends called to welcome him back, or neighbors spotted him in town and asked how the big trip had gone, he mumbled something about the culture being different, about the heat, about how retirement overseas wasn't what he'd imagined. No one pushed. Maybe they sensed the truth. Maybe they respected the boundaries of a man who looked like he'd aged 10 years and 8 months. Only Dave knew the whole story. It came out one night over whiskey and too little sleep. Robert sat in the den, the fireplace crackling beside him, the heat of the liquor making his face flush. His words came haltingly at first, full of qualifiers and apologies, but once the dam broke, it all came pouring out. The messages, the fake school, the threats, the night he left everything behind. Dave listened in silence. When Robert finally finished, his voice hoarse and barely audible, his old friend leaned forward, put a hand on his shoulder, and said the only thing that truly mattered. "You got out." Those 3 words, spoken without judgment or pity, settled something inside him. But healing was not linear. The nights were the hardest. He'd wake suddenly at 3 or 4 in the morning, heart pounding, hands shaking, his mind racing with memories. He would reach for his phone, ready to see Nia's name pop up with another demand, another manipulation. Then he would remember. He'd blocked her. He had severed that thread. The nightmares lingered longer, dreams where he was trapped in the hut with no roof, water pouring in, his voice silenced by red mud in his mouth, dreams where Nia stood over him, smiling sweetly as she locked the door and walked away with his passport. Dreams where he screamed for help and no one came. Eventually, he knew he needed more than time and soup and silence. He needed someone to help him understand what had happened and why it had broken him so deeply. He found Dr. Jennifer Martinez through a recommendation from a local veteran support group. Though he wasn't a veteran himself, the emotional trauma he carried bore familiar scars. She was in her 50s, with warm eyes and a calm voice. She didn't flinch when he told her he'd been conned by a younger woman in another country. "What you experienced has a name," she said during their 3rd session. "It's called a romance scam, and it's more common than you think." He wanted to argue that it wasn't a scam, that there had been real moments, shared laughter, intimacy, but the more he unraveled the timeline, the clearer it became. The manipulation had begun from the first message. Every kindness was strategic, every compliment calculated, every tear rehearsed. "How do I get over it?" he asked her once. Dr. Martinez folded her hands in her lap. "Time," she said, "and forgiveness. I'll never forgive her." "I'm not talking about her," she replied. "I'm talking about you." That struck him harder than anything she'd said before. He realized then how much guilt he carried, not just for being deceived, but for wanting so badly to believe, for being lonely, for being old, for being easy to manipulate. He had judged himself more harshly than anyone else could. "You were vulnerable," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. And the fact that you walked away when you realized what was happening, that makes you stronger than you think." Slowly, Robert began to reclaim pieces of himself. He took long walks every morning, breathing in the sharp mountain air, watching the snow recede from the treetops. He cooked for himself again, simple meals that reminded him of home. He reopened a few old history books, letting the familiarity of maps and timelines ground him. He started reading the newspaper again. Then, cautiously, he reached out to a local senior center to see if they needed volunteers. They did. He began leading small discussion groups once a week, talking about world history, politics, and literature. It was nothing grand, but it was something. It gave him structure, purpose, and it reminded him that he still had value to offer. 6 months after returning, he received a message on Facebook from an unrecognized account. The profile picture was a blurry sunset over water. The message, however, was unmistakable. "Albert, this is Nia. I know you're reading this. I'm pregnant. It's your child. Send money for the baby or I'll tell everyone what kind of man you really are. $500 a month or the whole world finds out." His stomach didn't clench. His hands didn't tremble. Instead, he took a screenshot and forwarded it to Carlos in Nairobi. The reply came within hours. "She's not pregnant. She's running the same scam on at least 2 other men, one in Germany, one in Australia. You're not special, just smart enough to get out." Robert blocked the account and deleted the message, and for the first time in months, he laughed. It wasn't bitter, it wasn't hollow. It was the laugh of someone who finally understood that some ghosts only have power if you let them. 2 years after his return, Robert moved into a small house on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled of coffee and toast, a porch with a rocking chair where he liked to read on warm afternoons. He didn't fill the rooms with reminders of the past, no framed photos of Kenya, no maps or souvenirs, just peace. He had begun dating again, slowly, carefully. A woman named Carol, a widow from his church who understood what it meant to lose and to start over. She knew about Nia, knew everything, and she didn't flinch. She admired his strength, his honesty. "You're braver than you know," she told him once as they sat watching the sunset. "I almost didn't make it," he said quietly. "But you did," she replied. "That's what matters." The nightmares had faded by then. The shame had dulled. The anger had softened into something more useful: wisdom. Once a month, Robert led a support group for victims of romance scams. Men and women, young and old, sat in a circle and told stories that mirrored his own. He always opened the meetings the same way. "The first thing you need to understand," he'd say, "is that it's not your fault. These people are professionals. They know exactly what to say, when to say it, how to make you feel seen. The tragedy isn't that you believed them. The tragedy would be if you let them convince you to stop believing in love altogether." He never thought he'd find himself again after losing so much, but the truth was simple. He hadn't been ruined. He had been rewritten. And in the rewriting, he had found a new story, one that was his and his alone. It was a Tuesday morning when the email arrived, an unexpected message from Carlos Mendoza, tucked neatly between newsletters and appointment reminders in Robert's inbox. The subject line was simple: "You'll want to see this." Robert hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the mouse. He had long since compartmentalized his past with Nia, stored it like an old box in the attic of his memory, still there, but untouched. Yet something about Carlos's message pulled at him with quiet urgency. He opened it. The message was brief, almost clinical. "Nia was arrested last week. Immigration fraud, multiple counts. She was running scams on at least 6 foreign men simultaneously. Ryan, too. They got sloppy. Looks like they'll be facing prison time. Just thought you should know." Robert stared at the screen for a long time. His eyes moved over the words again and again, searching for some surge of emotion, satisfaction, vindication, relief, but none came. Instead, a low ache formed in his chest, not for himself, but for the waste, for the intelligence and beauty squandered on deceit, for the other men who had not gotten out in time, for the culture of poverty and desperation that could make predators out of people with so much potential. He closed the laptop and pushed it aside. Outside the kitchen window, the early spring sun filtered through the budding trees, casting dappled shadows on the countertop. Carol stood by the stove, humming softly as she stirred a pan of scrambled eggs. She wore one of his old flannel shirts over her leggings, her silver-streaked curls tied up loosely. When she turned to smile at him, he saw nothing of the past in her expression, only the warm clarity of the present. "How was your morning?" she asked, setting 2 plates on the table. "Quiet," he said. "Just answered a few emails." He didn't mention Carlos's message. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He wasn't keeping it from her out of shame. She already knew the story in full, but because some things had finally lost their power. There was no need to reopen doors that no longer led anywhere. He joined her at the table, the smell of breakfast grounding him in a world that finally felt real. They ate in easy silence, occasionally commenting on the birds outside or the community garden project they had signed up for. When Carol spoke, she asked about the history discussion he was planning for his senior center group next week. When Robert answered, she listened, not out of politeness, but with genuine interest. This, he had come to realize, was what real love felt like. Not fireworks, not rescue missions, not grand declarations from foreign rooftops. Just presence, mutuality, truth. After breakfast, they took a walk through the neighborhood. The air was brisk but warming, the ground still damp from last night's rain. Children's chalk drawings lined the sidewalks and neighbors waved as they passed. Carol held his arm lightly. Not out of necessity, but out of habit, and Robert marveled at how natural it all felt, how the absence of tension could be its own kind of miracle. Later that afternoon, he sat at his desk reviewing materials for the next support group session. The topic this month was reclaiming identity after betrayal. He'd already outlined the key points, recognizing emotional manipulation, setting healthy boundaries, and understanding the difference between vulnerability and weakness. But what he really wanted to say, what he always returned to, was this: that survival was not the end of the story. For so many in the group, the betrayal they had experienced was not just financial or emotional, it was existential. It shook their sense of worth, their ability to trust, even their belief in their own judgment. Robert understood this deeply. He had spent months drowning in the shame of having believed, having loved, having hoped. But in the end, it was not the betrayal that had defined him. It was the decision to walk away, to start again, to believe, if only in small steps, that healing was possible. He thought of Patricia, a retired nurse who had lost over $80,000 to a man claiming to be a UN doctor in Syria, and John, a soft-spoken librarian who had sent his life savings to a woman in the Philippines who vanished without a trace. He thought of their broken voices, their tearful confessions, their slow, courageous attempts to piece themselves back together. He thought of the moment when he himself had stood in front of the group for the first time, hands trembling, voice thin, saying, "I lost almost everything, but I'm still here." That had been enough. It still was. That evening, he received a message from a man in Ohio who had read his self-published book, Fool's Paradise: How I Lost Everything to Fake Love and Found Myself Again. The note was raw and vulnerable, filled with disbelief and heartbreak. "Your story saved my life," the man wrote. "I was days away from sending my retirement fund to a woman in Colombia who I thought loved me. After reading your story, I hired a private investigator instead. She was married, 3 kids, thank you." Robert printed the message and pinned it to the corkboard above his desk, next to a few photographs of the support group, a poem Carol had written for him on their 6-month anniversary, and a hand-drawn thank you card from one of the seniors at the history group. It was a patchwork of reminders that pain could be repurposed, that truth could be offered as a gift, that survival could lead to something more than silence. 3 years had passed since he left the village in Kenya. He no longer tracked the days or marked the anniversaries. The memory of Nia had softened into a distant echo, no longer laced with bitterness or longing. He didn't miss her. He missed the man he thought he was when he loved her. But even that grief had settled into something manageable. He had come to understand that sometimes the dream you chase is not the one you need. Sometimes it's just the bridge to something better. One warm afternoon in June, he and Carol hosted a barbecue in their backyard. Friends from church, neighbors, and a few members from the support group gathered under a canopy strung with fairy lights. Children ran barefoot across the lawn. Someone brought a guitar. Laughter filled the air. Robert moved through the crowd with a calm steadiness, refilling drinks, flipping burgers, telling stories. At one point, Patricia approached him, holding a paper plate piled high with salad. "I've been thinking," she said, "about starting a second group, for women only. You think that'd be okay?" Robert smiled. "I think it's a great idea." She nodded, her eyes shining. "I never thought I'd be one of those people who recovered, but here I am." "Yes," he said gently, "here you are." As the sun dipped low, casting long golden rays across the yard, Robert took a seat beside Carol on the porch. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "You look happy," she murmured. "I am," he said, "more than I thought I could be." They sat there for a long time, watching the light fade. Robert thought of the man who had stepped off a plane in Nairobi all those years ago, suitcase in hand, heart full of hope. That man had been brave in his own way, even if misled. He had wanted to be needed, to be loved, to matter. But now, sitting in the gentle presence of a woman who asked nothing of him but truth, he understood something deeper. Real love did not demand sacrifice of self. It did not hide behind masks or threats or illusions. It asked for honesty, offered companionship, and made no bargains. It was not earned through suffering. It was shared through living. He no longer feared being alone. He no longer needed to prove his worth to someone unwilling to see it. He had found something quieter, steadier, more real. And in doing so, he had found himself. As night settled and the stars emerged one by one above the dark Vermont sky, Robert closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and smiled. The road ahead was his again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next video right here, and feel free